Okay, this is the second to last LangCamp Hangout of 2015, and we were talking about how grammar fits with communication, and hopefully going to squeeze in a little bit of student engagement, as well as some student choice. We have with us, I'm Laura Sexton, hi, and we have with us a few of our Lang Chat to LangCamp amigos. Let's start with Sarah. Would you introduce yourself, please?
I'm Sarah Bolaños. I teach Spanish in Maine at the high school level.
Muy bien. And Chris.
I am Chris Clymer, and I teach French 9 through 12 in Nashville.
Okay. And Barbara.
I'm Barb Klauser, and I teach Spanish levels 4 and 5 at the high school level in Hershey, Pennsylvania.
So a little bit of variety here. All right, so first of all, how many of you started off teaching mostly grammar when you started teaching the language? Is it just me? Because when I started, like I was an English teacher, and Sarah was saying that she had a psychology degree, and so they didn't really show us how to do anything, so we just did it how we'd been done, how it had been done to us, right? So, and like I was taught, you know the grammar, you know the language, even though from my own experience, I knew that wasn't true, and so it was a difficult transition for me. Oh, it's still a difficult transition because I'm trying to figure out where the grammar fits because some of my kids are still asking for it. Do you guys? Now, Sarah, you were saying that your kids feel less comfortable?
I think a lot of the kids who have more like a logical brain, who I remember being able to relate a lot of the grammar to math, like it's kind of like formulas and if this, then that, and I think a lot of the kids who maybe excel with math and have more logical brain, then I think they like being able to kind of move the sentences around and do the grammar stuff, while others maybe are glad that we're not doing it anymore. But I think that I need to try to reach more learners if I bring it back in. I kind of got rid of it the last couple of years because I've been trying to do more with communication and using the rubrics all the time, but I think I need to bring some back because a lot of kids are asking why we're doing certain things.
So you feel like you lost the ones that language used to appeal to when we did it the way they did it to us.
Yeah.
Okay. Has anyone else found that to be true, that the kids ask for grammar?
Oh, I think a lot of them really prefer to study about the language. It's so much more, especially at the adolescent level, it's so much more comfortable to talk about Spanish, to talk about French, to talk about the language they're studying rather than to talk in the language. So there's a lot of them that really prefer just studying the grammar, and they get really anxious if you say, okay, well, let's use, I mean, I don't think you can have language without grammar, because the grammar is the connective tissue, the logical relationship between the words. But there's a difference between using the grammar and studying the grammar.
Fair point. So you find that the kids want the grammar so that they can be more comfortable, perhaps because they don't have to put themselves out there as much, because it's not as big of a risk to study about grammar?
Yeah, perhaps. I think there's I use an analogy a lot of times, when you're speaking, especially with interpersonal, there's no delete button. When you're doing a workbook exercise or something, you can make an error and then back up and fix that error, and that's really comfortable to be able to do that. It's really reassuring to be able to do that. But, those of us that have been speaking the language realize, nah, that was wrong. I didn't make that agree, or, and when they're first learning the language, they don't like that. So
do you think maybe it's a... Oh, go ahead, sorry.
No, I think a good point was brought up. Adolescents especially, they like a right or wrong answer. And when you get away from the grammar and you look at more of speaking and trying to be communicative with it, there are no right or wrong answers. Many of the times there's a lot of answers. And they don't like thinking out of the box sometimes. They're very uncomfortable with that.
I wonder if that's part of not necessarily adolescence so much as our culture. Because I was reading a really interesting article one time where an American was observing a class, I think in Japan, and they took a student who didn't understand how to do the math problem and took him up to the board and watched him do it wrong. And the American was sweating bullets, like, oh my God, that poor kid. And then like the rest of the class walked him through how to do it right, and then they cheered for him. And so like that the growth mindset kind of thing that is at present in other cultures allows room for them making mistakes and encourage mistakes to get to that. So I wonder if it's really a characteristic of adolescence that they want to be right all the time, or if they want a concrete answer, or if it's a characteristic of our culture. What do you guys think?
Yes, to everything. I think.
All of the above.
Yeah, all of the above. I think the growth mindset has a huge part. I mean, that's a big thing in the last couple of years, and that's big into it. I'm also noticing, at least in our district, they're not putting an emphasis on grammar in the English classrooms. And this whole thing then I think bleeds into what we do. They don't have those same connections, even in their own language sometimes, to talk themselves through things. So again, I think it's the whole taking the risk and being willing to fail, and like you said, growth mindset, it all plays into it.
Well, and I think a lot of us have emphasized when we were like being taught, teaching how we were taught to emphasize accuracy. I cannot tell you how much time I spent getting them to pronounce things a certain way and put accents a certain place in Spanish 1. And like, why? Like, my son's in 1st grade, and if he can't spell, then, you know, he'll learn to spell, but I can understand what he's saying, and he's practicing the skills that will build up toward when he can spell. So so I think part of it might be what the emphasis has been in the past, that they feel like accuracy is the most important, and I think I think they are afraid to look bad. So that being said,
well, there's also the disconnect between, you know, they're adolescent learners and they know what they can do in their L1, and there's that chasm, and they just abhor the fact that they can't even structure one simple sentence correctly, accurately, the way they can in L1. So that's really disconcerting for them. And I think we as teachers really cater to that a lot of times when we focus on grammar, because we really want them to have the kind of accuracy that a 14, 15, 16-year-old would have, but a novice speaker is not going to have that kind of accuracy. And so we have to make them comfortable with being babies again, I think.
I tell my classes a lot, like when they're writing, I said, you're not going to be able to write like a 16-year-old. You can't, you don't have the ability right now. So when you're trying to put your sentences together, don't think as complex as you would like to in English, because you're gonna have to rely on the dictionary for every other word. Try to use the words that you've been learning, and then it's okay. You're writing, like, you're novice mid, you're novice high, you're going to have 4 words in your sentence. You're not going to be writing like your actual age. So I think that it's good for them to hear that from me, that I don't expect them to be. I don't want them to. I don't want them to rely on the dictionary for everything. It's so annoying, because then they pick the wrong words too. So.
And as an English teacher, I can tell you what Barbara was talking about with the lack of emphasis in English, and also with my kids are like, but I've been told to write complex sentences, and Miss Pacer's gonna be so mad that I'm writing baby sentences again. It's like, no, but it's about the audience. It's always about the audience in English or in your target language. What will they be able to understand from you? And like with the same way as in English, like building the fluency, the point is to get them to spit out what they're trying to say, and then you can refine it. But they have to have something to spit out first. They have to have something on the paper that they can edit, that they can do that. And I was just reading, we'll have the last hangout on Thursday on our Lang book on Make It Stick, and I was just reading in there that a lot of people use up their working memory trying to be accurate and like with anxiety. And if we keep the majority of the emphasis on the grammar, then that's going to be what's taking up their memory space. Is it RAM, or is it RAM is the working memory, right? I got my IT husband over there, and so like they're using up their RAM, talking about, or like worrying, do I sound stupid? Am I wrong? And so like if we emphasize that, we run a risk there. So there's a fine line to tread in both their native language and their second language. So it almost sounds like there's not a place for grammar with novices, but I don't think that's true either. So what do you guys think?
Well, I think the grammar should probably emerge if it's going to stick. And we talk about that. As I read through that book, I know we're not talking about it tonight, but I think vocabulary would probably be the thing that we want to stick. I think the grammar will and should emerge. If it emerges naturally, the grammar, I think, will become second nature. So that, if you take something simple like word order, I've got a 3-year-old that won't necessarily put words in either language that he speaks in the correct order, but that doesn't mean he's not being understood. That will happen. Just hearing the words in the correct order over and over and over and seeing them, when he's reading in the correct order over and over and over, I think that is how we learn how. I think grammar is always the how. Vocabulary for me is the what. So if they've got the context, it's okay to just throw chunks at them. I think the grammar, if we spend all of our time, if the students spend all of their time studying the rule and they don't really acquire it, they don't, it's not part of them, I think they'll confuse what they've learned with proficiency, and I think it'll fade really quickly.
That makes me think of the students that I just took to Peru, because they were saying, oh, write it on a piece of paper and I can understand them and I can write back to them, or I can conjugate, but but like they could not have a conversation with their host families, and they were very frustrated by that. So and there were some that still couldn't conjugate, so even with the grammar focus, they weren't even getting the grammar. So yeah, it's a question of getting them to see the patterns, don't you think?
Right. Yeah.
So, all right. So, what were you saying, Barbara?
I was just going to say, I think one of the struggles we're having in my department right now is, when do we have to step over and say, okay, accuracy has to matter at some point, as far as being able to be communicative and sound like a person that's moved up on the scale from intermediate, mid to whatever. Like, when do we make that leap with students? And I think we're having a real frustrating time trying to identify what that is right now. Our program starts in 6th grade. Obviously, we're not going to expect a 6th grader to do the same thing as a 9th grader to expect, or a 12th grader to do. So where we make that decipher, where do we decipher where that difference is going to be? So that's kind of where we are right now.
In my own district, they were concerned about that too. They're like, and the thing is, fossilization is the boogeyman that we're afraid of. That if they hear the errors over and over, then that's the way they're going to think it is. But in the same Make It Stick book, they said if you correct right away, then they won't get the bad pattern in their problem. And personally, kids don't usually make the same error, it seems like, unless it's like me llamo es, but they're still understood then. And like, when they're little baby novice parrots saying yo es, they're understood. I lied to them for so long saying that they wouldn't be understood if someone said yo es, but like they'll be understood. And one thing that I noticed in the Apple rubrics that ACTFL has for their assessment is that it assumes a sympathetic audience up through like the beginning of intermediate level. But my district is concerned. They're like, but they still be hearing the wrong things, and is it too late by then to be correcting them? Like if they get to 3 or 4, is it too late to fix those yo s's or things like that? What do you guys think?
I tend to correct a lot. I correct probably way more than a lot of my colleagues think I should. I don't penalize. And I think having kids has really helped me because my wife is French. And so, we're raising kids who are learning language. So it's like a little lab for me. So I do the same thing with my students that I do with my kid. If my son says, I can't think of a really good example here because I'm not Spanish. Okay, if my son were to say "Me llamo es," I would immediately say "Te llamas Jorge," rather than I wouldn't penalize him. I wouldn't put him in timeout for that, but I would immediately come behind him and say what the correct pattern would be. And I think it's important for our novices to hear and get that feedback, as long as there's no penalty associated with it. Because they want to say it right. They don't want to say it incorrectly.
So they're still rewarded for contributing and for like communicating with you. Like,
right, and I understood what he meant.
Right. And I also use my children as a little lab, and like my daughter, my 3-year-old was saying, I choosed, and it's like chose.
Right.
But then I think back to all the studies that say the correction like that doesn't stick. But on the other hand, maybe it's helpful just for the exposure of the input. What do you think?
We were just talking about this at the little conference last week, and whether you should be correcting them and interrupting their fluency of whatever they're doing, or just let them keep speaking. So I think it really depends on the situation. You know, if I've got my level 4 kids going with something and they're really into something and they've made a mistake that maybe I'm hearing over and over again, maybe at the end of things I go back and show it to them. But with a level 1, I might stop them because that might be, because if they're making a mistake, it might be far more communicative and cause issues with somebody not being able to understand them. Level 4, I think they have enough of a subject, like they have enough of the subject that they know that they can get a point across without always being completely accurate all the time. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong with that.
I don't stop them from speaking and interrupt them and tell them at that time. If I give them feedback on it, I would tell them if after class, or if it's a funny one, if they're pronouncing something wrong and that changes the meaning, then I would tell them like, oh, actually that it doesn't mean embarrassed, it means pregnant or something. But other than that, I think that I would just let it go. I think it kind of, if you correct them so many times, they kind of stop having the confidence to continue with the fluency. I don't know. I'm sorry, my internet keeps bugging out.
I'm just glad mine's not. So we're both abroad, so we know that is. But that reminds me of when I teach English too. We have low stakes and high stakes, and so the low stakes you don't correct. You're just trying to get them to spit it out and communicate, get an idea across, journal type things. So I'm thinking that maybe like just a practice conversation might be a low stakes for us, and then wouldn't need correction. It's a question of developing fluency. In the high stakes, we get into like presentational speaking and writing. Maybe that would be where it would be appropriate, like where they're doing more than one sentence at a time. Although, I mean, it's really easy to say you chose, instead of in the course of a conversation too. So I don't know. What do you guys think? Do we have low stakes and high stakes in second language as well?
I think you're right with the presentational. I think that if it is presentational, though, you're kind of correcting them or giving them more feedback as they're practicing, not for the finished product. Because for the presentational, they've got time to practice and they have time to have things edited. But with interpersonal, it's supposed to be more off the cuff and not really practiced at all. So I think that is more low stakes. And then presentational, I know that they have more anxiety over it, definitely, with the having to do the presentational. But hopefully they've taken the feedback that we've given them on the way up to do that.
So would you say we need to build in opportunities like where we swear we won't correct them, and then build in opportunities where it's part of their grade, or where we break out the highlighters or colored pens?
I think for presentational, I just think that we're making the corrections along the way. So when they're actually doing the presentation, yeah, they're drafts. So when they're doing the presentation, I wouldn't stop them. They might get something off on the rubric for not taking into consideration the feedback that we've given. But I'm kind of distracted right now.
So maybe it's a question of building in a recursive process where they rehearse the same things, where they rehearse something multiple times before we expect them to produce it without errors. Because it sounds like we wouldn't, stop their presentation either. So is the low stakes where we would correct them rather than the high stakes for us?
Well, I think going back to the growth mindset thing, the correction I don't think is the part of it that's a problem. I don't think that's the problematic. What's problematic is to feel like that an error is a failure, and if they can adopt that same mindset where they realize that they're making errors and your job is to showcase the right way of doing things, and everybody can approach that with a growth mindset, then it's okay. And I think everything, even high stakes presentations, or this is my final draft of my essay, well, if it has errors, your job, my job, is to make sure that they see what they are, so that the next time, I mean, the notion that there will be a next time, I think is so key, that there's a tomorrow, there's a next outing. And so even if there's a lot of correction, even if the paper or the presentation is filled with errors, as long as we're all agree that there's a next one where they can be better, if they can adopt that mindset, I don't think there's really any problem with all the correction. I mean, I know all the research about, and that's why I said initially I think I correct too much. And I think the reason that I still do it is I think I'm trying to make sure that my kids and I are on the same page. We're realizing I'm doing it out of love. I'm doing it because I want them for their next time to be better.
So do you correct everything that you see, or are
Well, I
there
don't,
some
like, I
areas?
wouldn't interrupt if communication is happening. I wouldn't interrupt, and I'm a big believer in, for example, like, to use the me llamo es, I wouldn't stop them and say, no, I'm sorry, you said that wrong, because that sounds like a penalty. I would say, me llamo Chris, or at the end of, I'd try to weave it into another, well, I don't speak Spanish well enough to do it, but, your brother se llama whatever, just so they hear it. And I think that is correction. And you use low stakes versus high stakes. I'm not sitting there with a check mark. Oh, yeah, and I don't count mistakes. Even when they do presentational writing, I don't count errors. That's never been how I graded. So, I'm looking at the whole picture. Now, I will mark them. This should have been, or this should have been, or I'll circle them and ask them later, what should this have been, for the correction, to get them to think about, okay, this wasn't quite what I needed to say. But I'm not counting those circles or counting the marks in order to come up with the score. The score is always a holistic, what proficiency have they arrived at here?
One thing that I do when I mark errors, I try and get them to keep it simple to begin with, but I've developed like a color code for types of errors. Like green is like the form of the words, like plural, singular, masculine, feminine, first, second, third person, and then like yellow is spelling, and then pink, they just picked the entirely wrong word, and like I'll mark them like that, so we group the errors, and then I can also see if they're making a pattern of errors. So like Barbara said, we could go back and like have like a little mini lesson if people are doing the same kind of thing. Are there errors that you wouldn't mark though? Like, because like sometimes my kids are like trying to use subjunctive in Spanish too, and I'm like, okay, guys, let's just rephrase entirely. Or do you mark everything, or do you just mark certain? Like, do you look for a certain thing in different assignments? How do you approach the marking?
Are you talking about structurally for grammar and things like that?
Like, if you're correcting a student, what kind of errors would you point out or not point out?
We've really focused. We've done FCA's focus correction areas for some things. Like if we're talking about we want you to express this in the future, then we are going to focus in on the future tense and how you're using it. And if there are mistakes there, then they might get, I hate to use the word penalized, but they might have to redo part of that for better communication. That's helped, I think, especially some of our newer teachers, because they were coming in trying to grade every single little tiny thing, be it accent, spelling, whatever, instead of trying to look at it more holistically. That helped them focus a little bit better and helped some of the rest of us. I have got to, and I've got to do this soon, because in a few weeks I'm teaching level 1 for the first time in about 8 years. I've been teaching levels 4 and 5, which is very, very different. Kind of remember what it's like to be that novice learner again, and kind of refocus things, because I've changed a lot in my teaching style since I've taught that the last time. Some of the things that I've been doing, now I can see it bleeding down into the lower levels as far as making things more communicative and not so, rule related and things like that. So this is going to be an interesting year for me. So this summer has been awesome, like with these type of things, getting some of these ideas out there. But I think the biggest thing in all of this comes, you have to know your kids. Some things that I can joke about with one group, if they make a mistake and we can have fun with it, I would never dream of doing with the same level of class 2 periods later, maybe. So I think it comes to knowing your kids and what you can do with them and how they're going to, whether they're going to be receptive to that or not.
Interesting point. I really like the idea of focusing on a structure or a couple structures. Do you focus on just one at a time and like adjust it for the level?
So far, that's kind of what we've been doing, depending on the task that we're asking the kids to do. That way, especially with high school kids, it just and we're trying to break them out of the pattern, but it's such a systematic thing too. Like the whole idea of I need to get the points, I need to get a grade, you're affecting my GPA, that whole idea. So that gave them something to focus in a little bit, gave us a way to pull back and not be so grammar on everything. It's kind of like a melding of a few things all at one time. I'm not saying it's perfect, but like I said, it's kind of helped us to see and let them kind of focus in on one thing. Okay, I need to really work on my accuracy for this particular thing. So, it keeps growing. We'll see how it goes this year too.
Have you noticed improvement as you do that, and that they are actually doing better with those structures?
I would say yes.
And is it just one at a time?
Just one structure at a time?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, most of the time. It might be a tense. It might be, agreement for adjective. It just depends on what the task is and what the level of the students are. So it just, I don't know. It's still growing. Like I said, we're still trying to figure out the pros and cons of it and how effective it truly is.
I struggle with the rubric, like after the final draft. If I've given the feedback and I've highlighted and said word order or adjective agreement or verb subject verb agreement or whatever, if I've done that and then the kid, like if that kid's come back like 3 or 4 times and we've gone over it together, how much of it, what I'm assessing them on is me versus them. And I'm not sure, like if they're doing a paper that writing about the history of their passion or something, then some kids, they come back for a lot of help, and then like I struggle with not giving them answers, but sometimes I do. And how do I assess them on the rubric for how complex the sentences are? Like I feel like I'm kind of doing a disservice to the kids who haven't come in to see me, or that I didn't give as much. Like maybe halfway through my grading, I decide that okay, I'm gonna give these guys the subjunctive for this because we just aren't getting it or something like that. So I struggle with the assessing for the final drafts after it's been through the feedback from the teacher.
I wonder, this is something that they suggested to me for my English teaching. I wonder if like that could just be a draft thing, because you mentioned doing multiple drafts, and if you use Barbara's suggestion of like picking one structure and say and their draft gets a grade based on that structure maybe rather than the whole final thing, because I like what Chris is saying about having the final thing being based on their proficiency, and we don't want to muddle that. So maybe the idea with the grammar is to keep it separate, unless it is severely interfering with the communication or advancing their level in proficiency or their performance level, technically. What do you think?
Well, that's kind of what I am concerned about if I'm giving them too much help with connector words and bumping them up as a performance.
You're worried that the final product is
more me.
Part you, is part
Yeah.
you and part them, whereas the kid that didn't come for any help, what you're evaluating in the end is just what they were able to do. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And a lot of times for our top line is I think it's comprehensibility, like how well the sympathetic listener can understand them, and I feel like they're always getting 4s for intermediate low or something because I know exactly what they're trying to say because I assigned it to them and I know what it's supposed to be. So I think sometimes if we had more time, we could do more of the inter-rater reliability and maybe switch off with another teacher, but in reality, who's got the time to be doing that for every assignment?
I think this might be a question of the assessment then rather than the grading, because like my kids do the PBL, the project-based learning, and actually their projects themselves are pretty much just a completion grade, like did you finish your presentation and have something ready to go. But then they have separate integrated performance assessments so that like they have to produce something spontaneously and use what they've been doing during the course of their project in order to do that. So like I don't like build up to a test quite like we build up to the project, but the true test, the performance where I'm measuring where they are on the proficiency scale is more of a spontaneous one and not one that I have helped them with directly, even though I've been helping them with the project all along throughout the unit. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I haven't done tests for a couple of years, and it's almost all project stuff. But that's where I struggle too. Like their performance, the presentational that they have to do is they need to talk, like for the passion project again, they have to talk about the history of their passion, how they learned it, who they learned it with, and all that stuff. And they've been getting feedback from me all along, and that is what they've kind of memorized to do that. And then they have their conversation with somebody about their different passions and exchanging ideas about it. But it's the speaking part that their paper that they've written, and then they have to do like 2 or 3 paragraphs from that paper as the presentation. So it's like they're memorizing what I've done for them or helped them with.
What level do they do that at? The passion project?
They do that as juniors, level 4. It's a great project.
So maybe their speaking needs to not be based on anything that's on their paper or their presentation. Maybe their speaking score should be based on what they can produce that is not already written down, that is not written down. So like when my students do the passion project kind of thing, they can write whatever they want on the slides, but they can't sit there and read from them. And I said they could have cards this time, but I don't think I'm going to do that again because like I want to see what they can say. So I mean, if it is memorized, I mean, I guess 4 they should be in intermediate, so it should be more than parroted. They should be in survival mode. So I don't know, like how could you get them to go to something spontaneous?
The part that there's a part they talk about the history, and then they talk about something else. I can't think of it off the top of my head, but then they go to a teaching part, so they have to teach an aspect of it. So if their passion is dance, then they have to teach the 5 positions to somebody else in the class, and that seems to be a little bit more spontaneous because the person they're teaching might not necessarily know how to do it, so they have to kind of correct them and be like, no, like this, and oh, great job, things like that. I really like how we've added that part to it. I don't allow any words on the screen at all. I only allow them to have images to kind of help their memory, and I think it's more engaging for the audience if they can find if it's their actual passion to see pictures of them doing yoga on the board, or like in their tutus when they're 3 years old or things like that. So it seems to.
So are they memorizing like a paper they've written ahead of time?
They memorize 2 paragraphs. The introduction, like the history of their passion, and then another part of it is like they get confused. They got confused this year. History. I didn't mean history like what's the history of wrestling. Like how old were you when you started wrestling? Who did you teach? Who taught it to you? Who do you play with? And then if they wanted the exceeds expectations, then they would incorporate other things like how are you going to continue your passion? Yes, I will coach Little League baseball and things like that. And they really like it because we can get out of the classroom. So if it's in the spring, it's their final project in level 4, and they go out and they if they're doing pitching, then we'll go to the baseball field and they'll show us how to pitch, and somebody else will show us how to bat or bunt, or we try to do the outside ones on different days, but it seems to work out.
Now we've got the student engagement, student choice.
Sorry, speaking entirely in the target language?
Yes.
Cool.
Yeah.
So now we've got some student engagement and student choice suggestions. So tie that in there. I really like how that works. I think the simple thing would be to just not make it a memorizing thing then, and just have them give an introduction and give an explanation off the top of their heads. And they can rehearse it, but it can't be one that's from there, I would think. I don't know. Like I have never taught 4 and never will probably. But like for my 3s, like they should be in the intermediate, and they should be able to produce something off the top of their head, I think.
I don't know. I think it depends on, if I were going to give a really important speech to my colleagues and it were going to be graded, I will have rehearsed it. I don't think that's inappropriate or not level specific, and especially for an intermediate high, intermediate mid. I think they're portions of it. I think it's normal human behavior to go, all right, I'm going to rehearse this, and I'm going to say this, and then next I'm going to say this, and then I'm going to say this. I think what we have to do, we have to balance that with sort of an interpersonal. Are they able to react when someone in the audience or you, the teacher, ask them a follow-up question? Because I think that's totally legitimate. and so I think it's fusing both of those. I'm assuming you ask questions or people from the
I
audience.
assign two. Each presenter has to answer 2 questions from the audience, and I started telling them the questions cannot have the word favorito in it, because all of them would be like, ¿Quién es tu jugador favorito? Or ¿Quién es tu equipo favorito? They can't think outside the favorito box.
Also, do you have a separate interpersonal and speaking grade? Because like at the novice level, there's not much difference, but when you get into intermediate, it gets kind of tricky.
Yeah, we do. They have to speak for 7 minutes, I think, with a partner, just about their history, with their passion, what they do, ask questions. Oh, who did you learn from? I learned also from my dad, or whatever they do. We have a nice language lab, so it's great to be able to do that and mix them up.
Have you guys all given up textbooks? Am I still the only dinosaur with textbook? Yeah.
I think textbooks have their place. We have levels 1 through 5, and then we also have an additional AP level. And of all of the levels, AP is the one we just got brand new textbooks for. And I found a pre-AP one that we're going to pilot this year in level 4 that goes with the AP themes and some of those other things. I don't have a problem with textbooks. I have a problem with the few people that we've had in and out of our department thinking that's the only resource that they should be using in the classroom. Especially because our textbooks are from, like, I think 2000 and 2002 are the most recent copyright dates we have from them. And obviously things change quite a bit when you're talking about culture and some of the other things that go along with that.
The reason I ask is because, we're talking about grammar and how it relates to communication, the communicative-based classroom. See, even when I first started, I always had the textbook series that we used, and I was really lucky because of the communicative series. It was the Allez Viens, I think was the title. And so I knew that I could explain the grammar, but I didn't want to, and I never used class time to explain the grammar because I knew the textbook that they all had and that they were all reading and consulting at home would explain it. What we would do when we were together was use the language, and that was always the way and I've always really, I guess, honed my craft by having that. So when if you're talking about indirect object pronouns or whatever you want to talk about, I think the chapter or the unit that we're doing is one where you're giving gifts or something, so it's going to naturally be fused there rather than me have to plan out, okay, when am I going to incorporate subjunctive? All right, when am I go into classroom and I just speak what seems naturally based on the situation, but I know that the grammar that's being meted out to them is following a path, so that I don't have to spend any of my time going, okay, now I got to make sure I do past tense and teach them past tense. I know that the book is doing that, so that I don't have to bother myself with, okay, now I got to do this.
So it's kind of a low-tech flipping the classroom.
Yeah.
That's what I was thinking too.
Yeah. Have you found that the grammar lessons that they do on their own are transferring to what they're saying in class and what they're understanding?
I do, yeah. Yeah, and I think we go back to the notion of kids wanting to learn about French. I think I have, probably as many of us do, 2 really different kinds of kids. They're the ones that really want to learn to speak French, and they're the ones who really want to learn French, and those typically are the ones that are a lot more concerned with their grade. And so they're going to study the grammar and they're going to memorize the vocabulary, but 6 months down the road, they're going to be frustrated because I'm still speaking at them and expecting the right things, and it's not things that they were able to memorize because it was 6 months ago. It didn't stick. So the kids that have bought in, and it's because I teach level 1 all the way through the AP level, those are the kids that matriculate up in those upper levels with me because they know, oh, we're learning this, but we're actually using this. So let's not confuse learning it with using it. And
That's
I think
like
the two
example
yeah, I
and
think
rule
the two
section of the stick book.
Yeah.
So do you find that you're able to satisfy like both sets, like the one who want to speak, the set who wants to speak, and the set who wants to learn about the language that way?
I think the kids that want to learn about the language satisfy their graduation requirement and then go on.
typically.
Okay.
That's what I'm finding. And the kids that really want to become proficient in the language, they recognize that using the language, acquiring the language is something that they can speed up by learning the language. But if they really want to be proficient, they have to do something else, which is acquiring the language. And acquiring the language is accompanied with a lot of errors. There's a lot of errors. And if there's not any penalty, I think, for the errors, then they'll study and practice, really low stakes. And, it's like somebody going to a place where they're going to speak the language, and realize I'm going to make a lot of mistakes, but that's how I'm going to get good.
One concern we have in the English field is that isolated grammar assignments tend not to transfer to their writing.
Right.
And so I wonder how you are able to bridge that gap, how you have found the connection with that success. Does it have to do with like the order in which you introduce the conversation topics versus the grammar exercises, or are your grammar exercises themselves more contextual?
It's always contextual. In fact, I would never, I don't, go up and put a verb chart on the board. I would never do that. It's got to be, like if it's a new verb that we're learning, I wouldn't, and even though the book sometimes does, it presents it in that way, the exercises of the book that I'm going to adopt wouldn't just have you conjugate without a sentence, for example. Because I think it has to be contextualized.
And have you found that the sentences are context enough? Because both teaching English and Spanish, like the little fill-in-the-blank things, like Make It Stick says it's supposed to work if you have a fill-in-the-blank, but like Jordan Yeager, who's one of our LangCamp buds, like he said that he's trying to teach himself French, and that he would do the fill-in-the-blanks and nothing would stick for him. It was sentences, and they were blanks, like Make It Stick tells us to do in that book, but like he didn't retain anything after doing that. Have you found that the sentence, that it maybe is a type of sentence, are they like connected in a story? Are they related to your conversations?
Well, I think it's just like it's one 12-second, 20-second exercise. They wouldn't just be doing a whole page where they were just doing that and then nothing else. So it builds so that the end result is they're writing a paragraph, or
Okay.
that they are having an interpersonal conversation. So it's building, so that little step, like if they were conjugating ouvrir, which is not a regular IR verb, it's conjugated like an ER verb. So the worksheet, the textbook worksheet, would have them start there, but in the end, they're talking about a birthday, and they open some presents, and their little brother opened a present for them. There's something built so that they have to use that verb, but in the context of expressing themselves. And if I were looking at that worksheet, if I saw big mistakes on that verb in the end, in the presentational writing, I could go back up through and see, oh, well, yeah, you were just conjugating like an IR verb, and that's the reason. Your practice didn't build.
Okay, that's very interesting, because I had to take applied grammar as an English major, and our grammar exercises were built like that, where we had to like find the errors and stuff like that, but then we had to write something using that structure.
Right.
And I found that a lot of stuff really stuck with me that way. So maybe the isolating it and then requiring some sort of output, do you feel like that's the key there?
Yeah, I would say so.
And do you feel that it works at any level, or is that more of an upper level kind of thing?
See, I have them doing it even at novice level. And that's the thing about the textbook, the grammar structure that they're required to do at the novice level is so basic, but it's about, word agreement, word order, simple things, and so that they practice those in isolation, but I'm never content with just having them do it in isolation, and I never assess them in isolation. It's always, all right, how does that fit in a big scheme of things?
So in a given homework assignment, they would have the breakdown ones of Uvria, and then, but by the end, for each night, they would have something to produce. Okay.
Yeah.
So just a couple of little like fill in the blank things, followed by a tell about your childhood kind of thing, your childhood presence.
Right.
I think it makes it more realistic for them, and it kind of builds the desire to be able to communicate. If they don't have a dog, why are they going to talk about having a dog?
Right.
If they're allergic to them, or other than to say they're allergic to them. But I think it definitely builds more buy-in when they're able to express themselves personally and about themselves, because that's when they're going to be using it. So if you can just have them rewrite the sentence, something that has to do with you using the same verb or something like that,
Right.
I think it's helpful.
And that's really funny, because in the same blog post where Jordan was talking about teaching himself French, he's like, I just wanted to talk about myself. And like the more I could do of that, the more engaged I was. So I think that might be the perfect solution. Like if your textbook's not already doing that, you add the personal element.
Right.
And we're back to student engagement. So tying it all together.
They love to take selfies, so they love to talk about themselves.
Oh yes. Any assignment you can work. He's gonna do. You have one.
I have a colleague, and she starts the year by taking these like really close-up pictures, and then one entire wall of her classroom is decorated with all these big bobbleheads, but they write a speech bubble. And so they put that speech bubble up, and the idea is, that those speech bubbles get changed out, sort of like the how you feeling today. So every week or every couple weeks there's a new speech bubble. So that's a really cool idea. And parents especially love coming in there and seeing all their kids on the wall.
That is cute. More of the student engagement and choice and personalization. Love that. We have about 10 minutes left. Do you guys have any other quick questions or comments about grammar, or do you want to share some ideas for how to get more student choice and student control? Preferences?
I think last week at the little conference, one of the things that came up time and time again as far as this whole debate about grammar, should it be, how it should be included, how we should work with it, and a couple points are brought up. Like some of the kickback as far as whether we should do this or not, they believe it's because the teachers coming into the profession now are not proficient themselves in some of these grammar things, and therefore can't explain it effectively to students, which I never really thought about that. I've been pretty fortunate in the student teachers I've had in recent years. They've had very good language skills, and they were able to explain things well when students had questions and things like that. But I thought, well, that's kind of, and there were higher level ed people there, so I thought it was really kind of a different spin on it for them to take back to the university level, because they're still doing things very much grammar driven in the university level, but not necessarily to the point where the kids are internalizing it and knowing what they're doing with it. So I thought, well, that's a whole different kind of spin on things, as those of us that have been in the career for a while and are looking towards the end more than towards the beginning, where this is all going from here.
Well, it's also relative to what Laura was speaking of. If you use the expression prepositional phrase with a sophomore in high school, they'll just glaze over. They don't want to hear those words. And when we have new teachers in my department, I try to get them to see, look, now you're speaking a third language that's foreign to them. If you use an adverb modifies a verb, I mean, that's not language that they use. And if it's not happening in English classrooms either, I just don't really see any point in engaging in that discussion. Now, I do, because I'm a dinosaur, I still am a stickler about understanding it and making sure that the kids do it. But I don't necessarily believe that you have to talk about it in order to model the doing it correctly. Like not saying I am well unless I'm not sick. You know what I'm saying? So doing it and modeling and expecting them to acquire the correct language, I think is important. But a lot of our English teachers, a lot of our respected colleagues have sort of decided that they too want to focus on the message and about the style of the message rather than going, I'm sorry, let's diagram that sentence. I mean, I don't think kids diagram sentences anymore.
We have dinosaurs in the English field too, and there are some kids it helps, and I will throw out words like prepositional or one of my favorites is like auxiliary verb when we talk about it. I'll throw that out there because I have a couple of smarty pants that want to be able to recognize those things and that are contemplating linguistic study in college. So I'll throw it out there for them, and they're the kind that'll latch onto it. But at the same time, we're dealing with, the 21st century skills, and the employers aren't like, gosh darn it, they sure can't conjugate. They're like, they can't string a coherent sentence together is what they're worried about. And, not too many employers are like, oh, that darn comma placement, that's why I couldn't hire him. And so, like, we have to focus on what will actually serve them in their native language and in their second language. Although I do want to point out that I do still use not conjugation charts exactly, but I do believe that a well-placed graphic organizer can help, and I use my little hand things, because like sometimes they want to go back and edit and make sure it's okay. Like I don't want them sitting there going, oh, us, almost on, like every time they say something, but like if they're trying to do something new, I want them to have something to refer to. Is that something that you think that maybe I should cut out? Or, because I was thinking of even emphasizing a little more to make them feel like they have a reference.
I think for Spanish, because we don't use subject pronouns, I don't think that that's a bad thing that a graphic organizer. Now, French is a little different. They do use their subject pronouns all the time. So theirs is more of a phonetic thing, like they can't always hear the endings. I think the kids that's where the confusion comes in with them based on my 25-year plus, removal from the French language. But I don't think graphic organizers are bad in the sense that you're talking about, for them to have a reference tool. The kids who don't need it won't use it. The kids who need it then have that tool. And that's not a bad thing.
Is it like crossing into dictionary territory, like, because we don't want our novices looking up every single thing? So is that like encouraging them to look up rather than take a risk and make a mistake maybe?
I think with anything, it's about finding a middle ground. You don't want them to be overly concerned with just saying I can conjugate stem changers, but I can't have a conversation. But you also have conversations where every verb is misconjugated. Every verb is just the infinitive. So you've got to find the balance where accuracy matters, but it's not the only thing that matters. And a place where, being able to be open and willing to make mistakes and still be communicative. I think there's a middle zone. Like there's some kids that they just want the right answer. They just want the 20 words. They just want the verb conjugations. And there are others that just want to speak and write and understand someone who's spoken to them or written to them. And so being the sort of middle person so that they see correctness matters. Because you're talking about the job interview. I think if someone writes their cover letter and it's filled with I is, the employer is not going to hire them, whether we like that or not. So my 2 cents.
Perhaps it depends on the level that they're aiming for. Like, if we know that Spanish 2 is it for them or French 2 is it for them, do we need to emphasize it? Or if we know that they're going on to French 3, AP Spanish, is that the point where we need to more carefully weed out the I is, or?
Well, I think, and this goes back to student voice and choice. If you recognize that what they want to have happen is facility with a language, understanding primarily rather than accurate production, then meeting their needs and making sure that they have a place where they can accomplish that is key. The kid that wants to go on, you've got to provide them, even at the earliest level, a place where they can practice accuracy. Because if they spend 2 years just saying je, être, both mispronounced and not conjugated, they're not ready for intermediate high when they get there. So I think you've got to meet all of their needs.
So it comes back to knowing the students.
Yeah, and student engagement. Figuring out, trying to give them what they want out of the process.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So maybe early on in a course, determine what their goal is, have them say what they want to have, and maybe like communicate the proficiency levels and have them decide what it is they want to end up with at the end of their language career in high school or something.
I like doing the lesson on the proficiency stuff. I do that every year. I have the last few years. We kind of go over the descriptions and we watch the video. There's some videos on Actful, I think. We kind of try to match them to what we think they are and then be able to explain why. In our school, this year we have 2 classes of Spanish 5 with 25 kids in each. So I mean, most of the kids that take a language continue on because it's such a college-bound kind of school. So I think like if I might have 1 or 2 kids in Spanish 3 total that aren't going on to Spanish 4. So the part we're kind of like going easy on some of the kids because they might not be taking it next year. I don't think that would work very well for me because I think the kids would be like, oh, you're going easy on George because he's not going on next year, or you don't care, or something like that. I think that for me, it's important to make sure that we push them all equally.
And then again, if it doesn't directly affect their grades, I don't know that how I choose to deal with individual students is really any of the other students' business. Like, I think like if I'm not giving George an A for something that I can barely understand, then and I choose to point out different things, I think that's within what I should be allowed to do as the grown-up in the room. And I don't know, like I think I should be able to adapt according to their different goals, and I think that's what we do for ourselves, is that we figure out what we want and we treat ourselves accordingly. I don't know, the whole other can of worms there.
Yeah, it is. That's a separate discussion. Whether you're measuring an item, an assessment, or whether you're measuring growth. Because if they're really about being able to talk to this pen pal they've got and be understood, and they grow in that ability, that should be an A, because they've exhibited growth toward the goal. And if it's a common goal, I mean, that's a goal that I would think as language teachers we would want them to have. So I tend to favor that goal versus I can conjugate every verb that we've learned this year. I just assume that usage and accuracy with usage is going to emerge. Anybody who wants to do a language, I assume that it's going to emerge, and that may be Pollyanna of me. But just like with my own kids, I just think it's going to come. It may not come at the same speed for everyone, but it's going to come. So my job is to get them all as far along their own trajectory as I can.
And if we had a whole other hour of talking personalization and how to approach it, and for me it's probably different too, because my classes have been under 25 for the last 3 years, and it's been glorious, and it's about to change. But I don't know, a whole other can of worms. That being said, our hour is up. And thank you for joining us, Chris, Barbara, and Sarah. And please join us. Check out Make It Stick to talk about our Lang book one last time on Thursday, 8 p.m. Eastern. Adios.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everybody.